So we are back, and we're going to move to a slightly different format for a few minutes with three people who have been listening to this conversation. And I want to invite them to join me on the screen right now so I can introduce the three of them. I'll very briefly introduce them. First, Dr. Ken Barnes, who is the Mockler Phillips Professor of Workplace Theology and Business Ethics, and the director of the Mockler Center for Faith and Ethics in the Workplace at the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Prior to his embarking on a career in the academy, he spent 25 years as a senior executive in multi-billion dollar companies. And so I feel like he has something to say about this connection of faith and finance, of economics and theology. And then a dear friend of mine who was fortunate enough to go to seminary with, the Right Reverend Jennifer Baskerville Burroughs. Jennifer I believe was the first African-American diocesan bishop in the Episcopal Church, and she is the bishop of the Diocese of Indianapolis. And from our own personal conversations through the years, and particularly in the last couple of years, I know she is someone who is deeply concerned about the failure of our economic systems and how that impacts us in the church and how the church has failed to speak to that. And then one of my dearest friends and business partners is Timothy Freudlich. And Tim was a co-founder with us of SOCAP, and he and my husband Kevin also founded one of the very first venture capital firms for good capital, and they did investing in things such as Better World Books. And Tim's day job, he was the founder of a company that impact assets that has, I think, and you can correct me because I'll be wrong, Tim, you can correct the numbers, that has, I think, $1 billion under management now, that's doing donor advised funds. Tim was the founder and CEO, but is now the executive director of strategic development, making sure that this thing called donor advised funds and this new way of funneling money to good is thriving. So I'm happy now to turn this over to Tim and to see what the three of you heard. And then probably in about 20 minutes or so, we will, you'll either invite me back or I'll just pop back into the screen, and even I will come back in and we can have a conversation among the five of us about where we might go next. So Tim.
Thanks, Rosalie. It's great. Great to be here. And Eve, for those very thought-provoking and kind of foundational interrogations of our market system. I really was reminded about how it's important to build response and a sense of immediacy and action upon real thoughtful rigor and slowing down. And in this particular moment, I think we're probably all struck by the tension. I know we've been wrestling with it a lot over at Impact Assets every day. In some ways for a long, long time. It's been a 10-year journey since we started that organization, but particularly, to get hit by this sort of global pandemic that has affected, so many people in a very kind of broad-based way, which has woken up the system by depressing it. As I think everyone on this call is acutely aware through friends and family and personal and institutional spheres of concern in church, and has been particularly brutal to those most disadvantaged, to those most cut out of the system, to those that have really been on the receiving end, and not a good receiving end of this market system that Eve had so elegantly talked about at those foundational levels. So this tension of pulling forth these real foundational elements and picking them apart, and then also being in a moment where where we're responding to racial injustice in a long line of racial injustices here in the United States over the last few days in a really powerful and upsetting and meaningful way, and then also watching the economies around the world grind to a halt. I think that it's, I want to kind of like live in that moment, that kind of that tension of immediacy and peril and depth of visceral kind of effect that I'm sure all of us have been feeling in various ways, with also this really important kind of systemic examination. So that's my, I just wanted to sort of say that because I think my responses are going to kind of be caught a little bit between, but I think that's maybe helpful to just kind of own. I want to actually turn it over at this point for a response broadly to Eve's commentary. Comments from both of the other two respondents, and then I'll circle back in and we'll pull in questions and have a lively debate. And as Rosalie said, we'll make sure that we bring Eve back in. And Rosalie, you're also welcome to come back to feed in there too. So I think Bishop Jennifer, if I could turn it over to you to just respond from your point of view and your faith and your vocation, like what really landed for you in Eve's discourse there?
Well, thank you, and hello everyone. It's so good to be in this conversation. As Rosalie mentioned, it's a conversation I've been trying to have in various places where I have been in ministry. I do want to say that by way of introduction, I was elected as the first female Black diocesan bishop, meaning the head bishop over a region geographically in the Episcopal Church. And so my area covers central and southern Indiana, basically from South Bend all the way down to Kentucky. So it's an interesting region. I am not from Indiana originally, I'm from New York City, and find myself in a place where we're trying to have conversations about money, which are always complicated. In fact, one of the things that I know was that when I was elected, there was a lot of conversation about how that now that there was a Black woman in the office of bishop with pastoral, spiritual, educational oversight, management oversight over this collection of 48 churches and schools, that we could talk about race. And within months I got here, and they had already been talking about race and how to dismantle racist systems and all of that, which was wonderful. But within my first couple of months, I discovered that what we really needed to talk about was money. And surely there's a lot of conversations that we need to have around the intersection of race and money, but it's just having the foundational conversations about race on the one hand, and then money and class and social location. And how do we talk about that thing that is so close to us? To Eve's point about how hard it is to have these conversations about what's on our bank statements, I reflected on how when I was a parish priest in Syracuse, New York, in a very racially integrated congregation, we were almost half and half Black and white with a smattering of Native Americans, because the truth of it was we were on Onondaga land, one of the members of the Iroquois Confederacy. And so there were still Native Americans, a reservation right down the road from us. So we were very diverse racially and ethnically. And we talked about how to dismantle race all the time, racism. But we did a forum for 6 months on money, on faith and money, because there was a lot of conversation in the Episcopal Church about that. And that was the hardest piece of the conversation. We were racially diverse and class diverse. And I learned 10, 12 years ago that because money represents so much that we equate with our own worth and value, that it was really difficult to talk about money in any way because of the feelings of guilt or shame, or I don't have enough versus that person who has more than I do. It was complicated, but I thought very necessary work. So now leading a diocese, which by the way, is unique in other places I've lived around the country, where they like to refer to themselves as the household. So we have a lot of language like diocesan households, which is new language for me, but of course gets to Eve's point about what economics is about in that Greek terminology, sort of the management of the household. So we use the language of household, and we're learning as a collection of 10,000 folks dispersed across the state, but people who have C-suite office jobs and people on public assistance. How do we talk about money, both individually and collectively? So we talk about where are our diocesan investments going? With where do we put those investments that allow us to have enough extra income to function and to do good work in the world? We have been looking at doing a diocesan capital campaign sometime in the future. And we have been beneficiaries of generosity of people like Eli Lilly, which has given us some foundations to do some work that we would not otherwise be able to do. And so there is a little bit of that noblesse oblige kind of culture that is in the water here. And also the sense that if you don't have enough money, there's just significant shame related to that. And so we said, if we're going to do a capital campaign in the future, sometime in, I mean, this is pre-pandemic talk, granted, right? So if we're going to have a capital campaign in 2024 or so, we have to do it differently. So digesting some of the teachings of Edgar Villanueva and saying, you know, instead of having people who already have money on this committee, we need to start differently. We need to actually listen to the people on the margins, to go down to the Ohio River Valley area of the state of Indiana and make sure that we're listening for what those folks want, not just people in Indianapolis, and then constructing a campaign that has people with means and those with less means on the committee so that we're making those decisions differently. And so when I hear you talk about how do we not just throw out capitalism, but somehow reuse it for our purposes of transformation so that we are using the resources we have, not just giving them values that are all evil, but saying we can take these and use them for good. You know, that's the conversation we're trying to have, but we're starting off with baby steps. And I think Eve's work is right on time for us, because she actually gets very practical with how the everyday decisions we make around where we shop, where do we buy our food, how do we support those who grow our food right here in the state of Indiana and keeping money more localized. We're beginning those conversations now because people realize now, particularly in the time of COVID, that everybody's essential. And there are no people who are more essential than others, and we all have an impact that we can make with the money we spend. So those are some initial thoughts. I look forward to the conversation.
That's great. Thank you. And Ken, why don't you jump in and give us your read out on sort of what you heard and what resonates, and also, you know, perhaps any. Do you agree with everything that you just heard?
No.
Not so much maybe from Bishop Jennifer, but from Eve, because I mean, there's some stuff that's kind of provocative in there, I think.
Yeah, I don't, and Eve knows it because Eve is a dear friend and someone whom I have the highest regard for. In my book, Redeeming Capitalism, I have a chapter where I put Eve in the same category as Thomas Piketty and others because I just think she's a very important voice. But we don't agree on everything. There's an old expression that if two people agree on absolutely everything, at least one of them is mentally ill. So no, even I don't agree on everything. But where we diverge in some ways is the way we look at capitalism generally. For me, capitalism is a subject, not an object. So what I mean by that is no one invented capitalism, including Adam Smith. He observed it. He never used that word. Of course, we know really Karl Marx gave us that word. But what he noticed was that there was this phenomenon of highly monetized, lightly regulated free markets that was very good at creating wealth. And so he wanted to understand it better. So he codified it, but he didn't invent it. No one invented capitalism. In fact, I refer to capitalism as a kind of economic evolution, which is why I don't have a big problem, by the way, with competition. In answer to the question, would Jesus play Monopoly? I don't see why not. God invented competition. We call it evolution. But, and this is important, evolution isn't only about competition. And where economics has gotten into trouble is because we have excluded cooperation. When I was in Oxford, I spent some time with evolutionary biologists, including Richard Dawkins, by the way, and you learn very quickly that no biological system can be healthy if it doesn't have both cooperation and competition. The two are not mutually exclusive. And so I absolutely agree with Eve when she looks at these problems of shareholder supremacy, of the invisible hand being treated as though it were some sort of divine force that we can't tamper with, which is absurd. When she looks at questions of pricing and the tragedies of the commons, I absolutely agree. So these issues that she raises, while I may not agree with her approach from a systemic standpoint, where I think we both agree, and this is what's most important, is that ultimately the problems are moral. If you think about capitalism as a subject and not an object, and you think of it as the accumulation of individual and corporate choices, that means that every economic decision that's ever been made was actually a moral choice. Whether it's a decision to close a factory in the UK and outsource the products in China, a decision I once made in the corner office, that was a moral choice as well as an economic choice. But so is the decision whether or not to wear this cheap Oxford College tie of mine or a $150 silk tie. That's also not just an economic choice, it's a moral choice. So if we want to redeem capitalism, if we want to restore the health of capitalism, then I think we have to accept the fact that we need to make different choices. We need to make better choices. And that's true from the top down as well as from the bottom up. And that's what I love about, when she talks about looking at her own bank statement as a report card. Well, that is absolutely true. And corporations should also look at their own income statements as moral report cards as well. We need to change the narrative and we need to change corporate culture. And that's not easy to do, but it can be done. And the church, in my opinion, and people of faith must be at the vanguard of changing the narrative, because we want to change behavior until we've changed the narrative. And as I say in my book, we have the tools available to us. The Bible says much more about money and work and economics and ethics than it does about heaven, hell, and sexual ethics combined. But the church spends more time on those things and not nearly enough time on these other questions of economic activity and how we are created by God, who is the worker par excellence. We are created in God's image, which means that, as Paul says, our work should be our worship. And the way we do capitalism, the way we do economics, the way we create wealth and spend money, all of these things should be seen through the prism of what it means to be created in the image of God. Now, some of the tools we have at our disposal are the biblical wisdom, which teaches us that there is a difference between self-love and selfishness. We don't have to be ethical egoists in order to recognize that a certain degree of utility makes sense, but we have to understand that group need and the common good are ultimately what we should be concerned about, not just our individual needs. Adam Smith was not Jeremy Bentham. I would say that Adam Smith was more a deontologist or even a virtue ethicist than he was an ethical egoist. Because if you read Moral Sentiments, you realize that he built everything he says in Wealth of Nations on the foundation of moral sentiments, in which he states that actually looking after the welfare of our neighbor brings more inherent joy to a human being than just looking after themselves. So if you think about how you lay that on top of what Eve talks about in this wonderful book, by the way, The Toxic Assumptions, of course we need more cooperation. Of course we need different business models and ownership models besides just the limited liability model. Of course we need more women in boardrooms. It's absolutely essential because there are evolutionary impulses that men experience differently from women. And it has driven much of the unhealthy thinking that has got us into the problem we're in now, where we think short term, we think instant gratification, and we don't think about the unintended results, the unintended consequences of our decisions. So in order to do these things, in order to change the narrative, the church is going to have to stand up and say, it doesn't mean everyone has to become a Christian, because the virtues are universal. You know, the cardinal virtues of prudence and justice and courage and moderation, temperance, these things are universal. They're Aristotelian. They predate Jesus by hundreds of years. But so are faith, hope, and love. Faith, hope, and love are also universal. And I would say that if we want to heal capitalism, we shouldn't be afraid to acknowledge the fact that we need faith in things bigger than ourselves. We need hope that the future we create will be better than the one we inherited. And we need love at the center. And love simply means concern for the other, as opposed to simply concern for immediate gratification for ourselves. We can do it. We've seen it in other avenues. And I'm confident that the church, if it takes the lead, can actually bring about cultural change.
And actually, I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more, just in that, in Redeeming Capitalism, in your book, you sort of talked quite a bit about this, but this sort of need to return almost to a Franciscan school of philosophy where love has to precede knowledge, and where it's this love of the other that's needed in positions of leadership. So when you kind of take that into this critique of market capitalism, or and also you sort of it as a, not as an object, like how does that really show up? Like from your point of view, practically, where does love show up in this system in a way that is articulable?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. You know, the people who operate in corner offices and boardrooms don't have horns. These are not evil people any more than you and I are evil or capable of doing evil things. But where the system does create problems is that it rewards bad behavior. And people get sucked into the vortex of this immediate gratification, this pressure to perform, to raise stock prices in order for people to exercise their options, et cetera, that turns people who actually care very much about their communities, their families, their neighbors, their countries, their environment, to make bad decisions. So we need to, first of all, we need to change the fiduciary laws, especially in the United States, so that we encourage stakeholder thinking, stakeholder economies. Because if you think about it, a stakeholder approach is an expression of love. I tell people when they ask me the question about love, you know, is there really a place for love in economics? I tell them that they have a mawkish understanding of love. Love is not the kind of love we read on the back of a greeting card. The biblical definition of love is actually given to us in a symbol, not in words. And the symbol is the cross. When he who had everything emptied himself for those who had nothing. So if we think of that in terms of virtue, it brings us back to the mother of all virtues, which is prudence. And the definition of prudence is knowing what to want and what not to want. And if we can get people to understand that what we should want out of capitalism, what we should want out of economics, what we should want out of business is not merely maximizing shareholder value. It should be human flourishing. Shareholders will get value from it, and they should, because they take risk, but not at the expense of the other. Human flourishing is something that resonates with everyone. And I'll tell you, by the way, this is true now. Goldman Sachs just did a recent study, a word study of the phrases that were being used by CEOs in their conference calls. And they're finding more often now, CEOs are using the language of stakeholder, using the language of flourishing, because their own investors and their own customers are requiring it. So we can change behavior by changing this narrative.
And Bishop Jennifer, and Eve, I'm going to ask you in just a couple minutes to come back in and sort of just respond to the response too. So get ready for that. And then we'll use that time behind the scenes to try to also collate some questions from participants outside of the panel too, and hit some of those quickly. But Bishop Jennifer, you did get to this a bit with the talking about the endowment and action, but practically, I mean, given everything that we've been talking about, what's the role of the localized church community? And this actually tees off a little bit about how Rosalie introduced, I think the switch here. But like, what do you see as the actionable steps and sort of the playbook, if you will, of how to activate, or if you can? I mean, if you were despondent about the whole idea, that's okay. I hope not. What do you think?
Well, I will say I love Ken's just pivoting to the notion of human flourishing, because I believe that's, we share those values, of course, and that as I look at the geography, my sense is that the hope is in the local parish, the local congregation that is embedded in a place physically and has the ability to impact change in that location. So it's an interesting thing to think about now when we're meeting virtually all the time and doing everything across Zoom, which kind of obscures the notion of locality. But when I think about what is the church, I'm visualizing Vincennes, Indiana, or Indianapolis, or Carmel, these locations where the congregation is a place of stability and agency in ways that if we were able to be more thoughtful and intentional about it, we could actually make an impact. So, of course, my dog decides to speak today, so don't mind him. But it's the sense that, where we spend our money matters. And so in the local congregation, being able to actually do the exercise that was really popular back in the early aughts when locavorism was a thing. And I was a proponent blogging daily about how to be a good locavore, eating within your food shed. You draw 100 miles around the area that you live, and you think about how do you feed yourself and how do you spend your money in a potent way in that 100-mile radius. And so congregations, I think, can be called to think about, not just the global, because, we need to pay attention to the larger systems as well, but the power that we can have when we concentrate in our neighborhood, not just where we spend the money, but who is in our neighborhood, who are the people who we share these resources with, how do we care about making sure that the neighbor next door has what they need. And so asking questions about what is enough, not just for me, but for my neighbors and my neighborhood. I mean, those are the kinds of questions I think we can actually move the needle if we're going to use the capitalist system and to look at things really differently. What does it mean when we need to eat and we can't get to the grocery store, or the grocery store folks are at risk in this time of COVID to make sure that we have food, or the people who are growing our food who don't get a chance to stay, they might be staying at home in a different way, but their jobs are still necessary in order for us all to eat. And knowing who those people are, all of those things, I think, humanizes these conversations and helps us to make it less abstract and a lot more meaningful, because we realize that our dollar bills or our ATMs or our phones, however we're paying for our goods, actually have real life consequences for people and for ourselves. So that's a little bit about how I would answer that question. And I will say that when people hear the, excuse me, my dog has a bone. When people hear about, when people hear about, like, what does it mean to be someone who eats within their food shed or only buys locally, and that becomes really, it can devolve into a question of elitism, and only those who can afford to eat that way, because our systems, our economic systems, are set up to favor mass-produced food that's maybe done in a way that, for models of efficiency, aren't in line with our values. That we need to actually think about how we can change those systems too. There are choices that we can make at every level, local and nationally and global, that can help us to be able to make sure that these are ideas and questions, not just for those who can afford it, but for everybody.
Yeah, I think, I mean, so many of the comments have touched on this, but I do think at a central core, this community, or the converse, lack or loss thereof in the system is really central as something to examine and to really invest in recatalyzing the local social contract, economic contract, environmental contract, because I mean, to my view, and I think lots in the community development economic movement and the impact investing movement in the United States, at least that I work a lot with, it's this anonymity and this speed and this disassociation and this loss of in right relationship thing that the market has done. This technology enabled amazing flow of information and ones and zeros that has unlocked, arguably lots of good, right? And innovation. The system really does, it's just set up to completely disconnect us from each other and gamify it, as Eve was saying. And so I think there's something here, like that, whether it's your local community within your faith context, or just around the farmer's market and the local practitioner, and that pound turning into 1.76 pence versus 36 pence that Eve was talking about. I think I think that it's really worth slowing down and bringing that up. Eve, do you want to, while we pull some questions from the audience, get those ready, do you want to chime in on anything that you've heard here and give us a couple minutes of your thoughts?
Yes, please. I think I've got 4 things I'd like particularly to pick up on. Just picking up on where we got to just now around this sort of disintermediation, and we don't really know who we're dealing with and who's in the supply chain and all that kind of stuff. One thing that is really interesting about Adam Smith's moral sentiments is he has a very quirky view of ethics and why we behave well. And it's not particularly Christian, actually. He says we behave well because we're held in the gaze of the other. And while we're held in the gaze of the other, we want to impress them by behaving well. Now, whether or not you agree with that, I think it strikes at the heart of this sneakiness that's happened in the market, because it's all disintermediated. We can't see the other. So we can't see the face of the person in the sweatshop. We can't see the people we're harming, the people who are left out. We just see, an online thing where we can click and, whatever. And the reason I did my research was, it was about trying to see it, because like so many other people, I didn't really want to know. It's all a bit, complicated and, easy just not to know. So there is something, and this, I guess, is where I'd really pick up on what Bishop Jennifer said about the radical transparency of the bank statement moment, and sitting down and talking about where you're invested, what are you doing. As you'll know, the Church Commissioners for England have a portfolio of about 8 billion that they run as a kind of ethical investment play to yield money to pay for the Church of England. And really difficult conversations there about, particularly at the moment with fossil fuels, should we exit? Do we want the taint of being involved in fossil fuels? And the commissioners have made what I think is a very brave decision, which is to wrestle with the angels. So we're forcing them all to sign up to the Transition Pathways Initiative. We're forcing disclosure, we're forcing transparency, and we'll exit if they don't shape up. But while we're engaged as an investor, we are making them change their behavior. So there is something for all of us, which is we've got to get the scales out of our eyes, the plank and all that kind of stuff. We've got to Google those companies. We've got to find out what's happening in our neighborhood. We need to be really honest with each other. And I think that is one of the things that is different if you hear what I say about the very rootedness of the competition narrative, because an awful lot of that is using information as power and not disclosing and hiding, and a whole load of plays which feel entirely normal to an awfully large sector of the population and has come up in kind of plays and games and philosophy and theory, again, all by men over the generations, so we've never questioned it. But actually risking being open, risking being honest, risking being transparent, seeing the gaze of the other, that tends to just drive better behavior. So that would be something I want to say about radical transparency. A quick story for you. You talked about the Franciscans, Tim. This is something for those of you who are involved in companies, because I discovered through a colleague of mine in Oxford that the legal basis of the company was Franciscan, because the Franciscans had a load of property, but they had a vow of poverty, so they couldn't own it. So they had a real problem. They had all these farms and stuff, and they couldn't really defend themselves if people wanted to just steal stuff or take fields or whatever, because they couldn't technically own it. So they created this legal vehicle under a papal bull, a company breaking bread, company breaking bread together. It's a very Eucharistic thought coming from a Franciscan community, which is how do you create something other than us, the community of the Franciscans, which is freighted with Christian intent, but needs to be spun out because of our own personal vows. And I really love it when I'm working with companies, is to remind them of that heritage, which is that companies are supposed to be places where we break bread together. And that, I think, helps drive a different conversation around hierarchy and role and family, and that whole thing about the diocesan household that Bishop Jennifer mentioned. Two other things. Bishop Jennifer also mentioned the kind of worry that if we're shopping locally, there might be a kind of elitism thing around that. And I noticed from some of the comments and questions, there's a real concern about how expensive it is to shop ethically and to shop locally. And I really hear that. I think we all have fights in our own households around overpaying when you could get stuff cheaper. Very interesting study. I used to work at Ashridge Business School, and they did a study there about organic shopping, because there had been an assumption that the poor don't shop ethically because they don't care about ethics. They just want cheap deals. So they were hired by a load of supermarkets to find out what the demographics are around shopping, and particularly behavior around organics. And what they found was that actually there was a higher propensity for ethical shopping amongst the poor in the community. It's just they couldn't afford to because it was all premium priced. The poor know better than anyone else that, you know, garbage in, garbage out, because they don't have an awful lot of money to spare and they don't want to waste it on rubbish. But if that's priced out of the market by premium pricing because the middle classes can afford the organics and the fair trade, then that just means that the poor can't afford to eat properly. And that, I guess, would travel into any premium priced ethical product, which gets me back to my point in my book about pricing. Is while we stop having that conversation about just price, because the market price is now the just price, we stop looking at cost and externalities and what pricing means. And again, I think if we have that conversation again now, particularly in the light of COVID, we would start noticing some very interesting things that have been happening around pricing, and that would help us make better decisions about what is cheap, what does that mean, who's paying, and are we happy to collude with that?
Not to mention, I was just going to hop in, not to mention, you know, this, to your point, like this externalities, the subsidization of whole industries and product groups that goes on in governments all around the world. And, you know, we know the US in particular, you know, making energy cheap so that we drive carbon, you know, climate change, climate warming, but also just, you know, industries that have received massive aid from the government and large companies, and that you know, it completely perverts the right pricing and the right relationship of consumers to, you know, the kinds of things we're talking about. So I think it's important to just call like this invisible, you know, pricing efficiency thing. It's a total fabrication of a whole bunch of underlying decisions that we have made as civil societies or as people who've handed over the power to folks who may not be representing our best interests. So sorry, I just had this, I had to go there.
Absolutely right.
Amen.
This is
Yes.
the thing about radical transparency again, is that if that we actually, it's not that we necessarily will change it overnight, but if we force the transparency, then we can see it, and then we can decide if we're happy with that. But at the moment, because it's all secret, we collude with it and no one asks the questions. And of course, Christians in particular have a huge heritage on Just Price. We did a lot of thinking about that. It's just that the market took over and said the market price was the Just Price, and we've forgotten all that, but we can rediscover it. And my last thing I wanted to just pick up was something Ken said about choice and about moral choice. And I'm really worried about that because it sounds right. It sounds like we have agency, we have choice, and as long as we are moral and we've read our Bible, we'll make the right choices, and then the market will kind of turn. I think the problem is that choice is not neutral anymore, if it ever was. I talk a lot about choice and character in the book Buying God, because consumerism is an exercise in trying to trammel our choices and influence them and school our desires in the wrong direction, so that we don't really see that it's not a free choice. And a huge amount of behavioral psychology around that, of course, that the advertising fraternity are particularly expert at. But also the choice architecture, the problem about the kind of markets we've got. I remember coming over to the States the first time in about 1990 when I came to high school in Connecticut, and being overawed by your supermarkets, because even in the 90s, Britain didn't have the sheer volume of products that you routinely had on your shelves. And I just didn't know what to do with myself. It was just all so exciting. And they did a project about jam. They gave people vouchers for jam, and they took them into shops and asked them to buy some jam. And in some shops, they had like 2 or 3 jams. In some shops, they had like 24, 25 different jams. And by playing around with the parameters, they found that the optimum choice was 8 jams. If you had only 8 jams, people would generally buy one with their vouchers. If you had fewer, they didn't think there was enough choice. But if you had more than 8, most people didn't spend their vouchers because they were so flummoxed by the choice. They just couldn't decide. Now we know from nudge theory that there's a huge amount going on in public policy around how we nudge choices. And we all know from unconscious bias and from our educations and everything that our choices are not neutral. So I absolutely agree with Ken about the crucial area of choice as something around agency, but therefore, particularly in Christian communities, we have a huge job to do to help grow character so that we can make better choices. Because I think a lot of the problem at the moment is we don't have the information available. We don't take the time to find the information because there's too much of it and it's overwhelming. And then we end up making poor choices because we just don't know any better, or we don't have the strength because we haven't honed our characters to be able to be held in the gaze of the other and be defiant and do something better, even if we think that might raise eyebrows.
Great. Well, I'm just looking at some questions or the clumpings of questions behind the scenes here that can anyone, Eva or respondents, just in terms of other business models, cooperatives in particular, you mentioned a couple of different times, Eve, B corporations or for-benefit corporations, as we sometimes call them, in slightly different context here. But like, is there like a message for resilience or an opportunity for resilience in moving to those models? And how does that tie into the conversation that we've been talking about? Like, you see the actual business models that are maybe perhaps a little bit on the edges of the mainstream as providing an opportunity to really move at a systems level? And are they scalable, or is it localized, or any thoughts or reflections in that area?
Well, shall I start and the others could maybe chip in? I mean, this is a bugbear of mine because there is a monopoly in the market around limited liability. So all the accountancy firms, all the professional services firms, that's the model they know. So they've optimized all their advice around it. So I had to set up in business in order to trade with my old employer when they wanted to keep me on as an associate. And because of everything I've ever written, I wanted to set myself up as a sort of ethical thing. But because we were about to run a course and I had to set myself up within a week, the only vehicle that was available to me to set up in such a short period of time was a limited liability, either a company or a partnership. And I couldn't find anyone who would help set me up as anything else than that in the time frame. And I've spoken to loads of people who have tried to convert to, there'll be loads of different models in the US, but over here there's community interest companies, there's a whole lot of other things. And it just seems impossible because there isn't the professional service advice there aren't the templates, there isn't the public policy support, there isn't really the law. So there's a real challenge for public policy in trying to create more of a market here. In the UK, there's a lot going on around employee ownership. But in order to buy out a company, say you were going to buy out Tesco, because of the market capitalization of it, each individual employee would need to have access to so many thousands of pounds to buy their share. It's not economically possible unless you take on a load of debt. And of course, taking a load of debt is not always the best way. So there's some technical transitional things which are being fixed globally in lots of different corners. Best practices are being built up. But because there's such a monopoly, and it's not in anyone's interest for this monopoly to be toppled, the change is slow. The thing I know, though, is that when you look at this shareholder value nonsense and you look at this, the only business of business is business, it's actually invented. It's not really the case in law at all. It's a 1970s invention that became very popular. And actually, companies are very well able to take into account other interests. So in some ways, the benefit corporation, the B Company initiative, has been a bit depressing because it's kind of agreed that the limited liability companies are kind of evil, and you're either one of those or you're a B Corp. And actually, what I would want is to run the transformation within the PLCs and within the limited liability companies to say, even within this structure, we don't need to be making quite the choices we have done, because there is a bigger game at stake here. So I still think we can do some more redeeming before we have to do dismantling. But I'd also want to see more startups, instead of just going into what's easy and available, is fighting hard to get those business models available that they could cohabit instead.
And Ken, that kind of gets to your stakeholder, like trying to move to a stakeholder system comment or a set of comments that you made, and also a couple of questions that have popped up around sort of the nature of ownership within the system and the role of owners, and like how do we reorganize the very definition of being an owner within a complex, large system of capital and business and society that is actually aligned and practically functional within the kinds of issues and morality that we're talking about on this, today. You're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now? My wife wishes she had that button, believe me, mute, unmute. This is a huge topic. And again, in my book, I talk about how we need to redeem markets as part of the solution, as it were. And that really means redeeming how we trade shares, how we view ownership. The Bourse system, in a sense, is dead. The original Bourse system, where you raised capital, but you sold shares, and you had people involved in the success and failure of companies, there was a relational aspect there, an almost covenantal relationship between success and failure and risk and reward. That's all gone now, especially with the hyper trading that goes on, where people buy and sell shares. The shares are the commodities themselves, and they're completely divorced from business fundamentals. But take that aside for a moment and just think about the possibility for the future of the labor movement going forward when it comes to ownership. For me, when I look at the history of the labor movement, which started really as a health and safety movement, then a job security movement, then a wage and benefit movement, the future of it really, in my opinion, should be an ownership movement. There's an opportunity for the unions to step up and say, we expect a living wage. That's not on the table anymore. We demand basic rights and services and benefits, especially in America, where most people get their health care from their jobs. That's not on the table anymore. We want employee ownership. We demand employee ownership. I think the labor unions could start a movement that would transform the way we think about corporate ownership in ways that right now isn't being discussed. So for me, that is the constituency that has the highest probability to impact change in this area. Now, there are other things out there. We are seeing more and more share options, et cetera, and mutual companies, and I'm all for that. But I really think that the future of the labor movement is missing an opportunity by not making ownership the key demand in the future. And by the way, if I may also say, Jennifer, or Bishop Jennifer, you are spot on when you talk about how this has to happen from the bottom up and at the church level. I convened a group of scholars, business practitioners, church leaders at a conference recently. How do we go from the can-do of redeeming capitalism to the how-to? And I thought this group of people were going to talk about the top down, and no, they wanted to talk about the bottom up. They wanted to talk about how we can work at local church level and at the seminary level, training people in economics and in these issues, and empowering the local church to empower Christian business leaders to be salt and light and agents of change. So I think there is an appetite for that at the local church level. I think you're muted now.
Tim, you're muted.
Well, the cat calling. So Rosalie, did you, I think you had a question that you wanted to pose here. Can I invite you in to throw that out there?
Yes, I have a question for every one of you. And I'm going to ask the question and give you a minute while I make a couple of announcements and then come back to you. But, and Eve, this is for you too. For every one of you, a 15-second, 30-second answer to, as a result of this conversation we've had today, what's one thing that you are thinking about doing differently now? So y'all ponder on that while I thank everyone for being here. This has been an amazing conversation. Very exciting to me to have friends and colleagues talking about things that matter so deeply to all of us in this way. And on June the 12th, we're going to be having our next webinar with Ross Baird, who is the founder of Village Capital, that's invested millions of dollars in social entrepreneurs around the world. And a couple of years ago, started a new project called Blueprint Local that is working in Austin and in San Antonio, particularly with, I'm getting a message, my internet is unstable. Okay, Ross is working in different cities, but particularly in San Antonio with David Robinson Jr., who runs Blueprint Local in San Antonio, which is where we will have a conference when this COVID thing is over. And David Robinson Jr. is the son of David Robinson of the San Antonio Spurs, an NBA great, a Hall of Famer, who had been putting his money in the local community for many years. And his son watched what his father was doing, came to SOCAP to find ways to get more deeply involved, met Ross there, and now through a very deeply faith-based perspective, they are doing deep work in the east side of San Antonio with a school and other investments there. So we're really looking forward to that conversation, which will be followed by a panel of folks who are working in San Antonio in all sorts of other ways on church assets, on social enterprise. We're real excited about that. So now that I've given you a minute to think, and I'll start with you, Tim, because you've got a great smile on your face right now. What's the thing that you might think about differently?
But I was smiling about the expectation of how great that session and panel is going to be. Not no. You know, I guess I'll connect it back to sort of the few comments I made at the beginning of the time, which is, I think that constructively, I feel that we're in a time, again, it's a time that we've been living in for decades and hundreds of years maybe, but certainly for many years, where we have to figure out action. And I take away from this that kind of reinstalling or reconsidering kind of the fundamental design principles that we're trying to affect and pull apart and reconstruct along kind of these assumptions that Eve has laid out so brilliantly. I think that bringing that very transparently and sort of affirmatively, articulately, right up to that then action union. These are the discrete, and I think you could do this personally. I'm thinking more organizationally of really saying, okay, these are the 4 or 5 or 7 things that we're trying to pivot on. What are the action steps that we can take today and tomorrow and the next day and sustain to move around social and environmental justice and inclusion and positive change in the world that we all want to be a part of and see. And so just taking that immediacy and that rigor and that sort of foundational, that's what I'm taking out of this, and to really commit to doing that.
This is Jennifer. I guess I'll say I'm finding myself thinking that I need to continue to do some deep learning on this. I will confess that I have been the person to say, late stage capitalism has got to go. Like we've got to, I've got Stokely Carmichael in my ear talking about to be anti-racist means to be anti-capitalist. And, I got that radical edge, and then thinking we've got a system and we do have more power to change how capitalism works. And so I want to dig deeper into that. So the notion of redeeming capitalism, looking at how our choices have value to them that we can actually shift, and how I might preach about that a little bit differently. So I'm feeling called to do some deeper work, because if I'm going to lead in this area, it's not, it's all intertwined and intersectional and not divorced from our current moment. And so the call to go deeper so that I can help my folks find their agency and being agents of transformation, but in a way that can actually move the needle. So I'm just so appreciative of this conversation. Eve and Kenneth particularly, I look forward to continuing to learn from you.
Ken, what about you?
Well, first of all, let me just say, Bishop Jennifer, please send me your address. I will happily send you a copy of Redeeming Capitalism. That would be my joy. If you forgive me, I'm not going to answer the question. If I may, I'd rather leave with this quote from Adam Smith, simply because I think it brings together the topic we've been discussing today and this moment in American history right now that we're seeing played out on the streets. And it is this: the disposition to admire and to almost worship the rich and the powerful, and to despise or at least neglect persons of poor and mean condition, is the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. Moralists all down the centuries have complained that wealth and greatness are often given the respect and admiration that only wisdom and virtue should receive, and that poverty and weakness are quite wrongly treated with the contempt that should be reserved for vice and folly. I think that absolutely sums up the problem we have today, this grotesque worship of powerful people, rich people, and this disdain or this non-engagement with the poor. And God is the champion of the poor. If the Bible teaches us nothing else, it's that God is on the side of the poor. And we've got to change the way we think about the people who are most in need. I think that's capitalism's greatest sin.
Thank you, Ken. Yes. Eve, dare we ask you, is there anything you might change after being in this conversation with us across the pond?
This is so inspiring, and I'm so excited about us all immediately leaping to our feet and rushing off and transforming capitalism. So thank you, that's given me great hope. The thing I'm going to do differently is when I'm looking at my bank statements, I'm going to really challenge myself to see where my spending is in solidarity with other people, rather than pandering to middle class preferences around goods and service I would like to stay around, because there are a whole load of things where I may not choose to shop in those places, but if I don't, then the poor and different sorts of people who need to access those kinds of goods and services won't be able to because they won't be there anymore. So I'm going to challenge myself to try and spend a bit more time thinking about solidarity spending as well as spending in my own right.
Thank you. And thank you all for being with us. And I don't know that it's going to be different, but I am all the more in desiring you to come back, Eve. We want to have you with us again and again. I've learned so much from you, and I'm looking forward to the book study this summer. We're going to be doing a book group on finding God, which I'm fascinated with the idea, buying God, sorry, not finding God, buying God, with the idea that our desires will lead us in a godly direction, and how to refine that with our purchasing and how we interact with the economics around us. So thank you all so much for being with us. And again, June the 12th at noon, come meet David Robinson. That's the reason I'm going to be there. No, I'm joking. Ross Baird is a hero of mine in a different way, but I'm really looking forward to that conversation. Thank you all so much.